James was concerned about the selfishness of the rich and advised them to weep and howl. He gave 3 reasons for his exhortation here. First reason, the way they got their riches. And we'll see this in verse 4 and the first part of verse 6. And so he addressed the way they got their riches. The Bible does not discourage the acquiring of wealth. The Jews in Canaan owned their own property. They worked it, and they benefited from the produce. In several of the parables, Jesus indicated his respect for personal property and private gain. There's nothing in the epistles that contradicts the right of private ownership and profit. What the Bible does condemn is acquiring wealth by illegal means or illegal purposes. The prophet Amos thundered a message of judgment against the wealthy upper crust who robbed the poor and used their stolen wealth in selfish luxuries. Isaiah and Jeremiah exposed the selfishness of the rich and warned that judgment was coming. James gave 2 illustrations of how the rich acquired their wealth. They acquired it, first of all, verse 4, by holding back the wages. So the laborers were hired and they were paid by the day, and they did not have any legal contracts with their employers. The parable of the laborers in Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16, it gives an idea of the system that was used during that day. You can go back and read that. We see in the law, God gave definite instructions concerning the laboring man in order to protect him from the oppressive employer. I want you to take a look at that. So Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. And I'm going to read them to you if you just want to listen. Deuteronomy 24, verses 14 and 15. Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of thy brethren or of thy strangers that are in the land within thy gates. At this day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor, and setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee. Leviticus 19 and verse 13. Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. And then again in Jeremiah 22 verse 13. Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that useth his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work. These rich men here had hired the laborers and promised to pay them a specific amount. The men had completed their work, but they hadn't been paid. How would you like to work and not get paid? I don't think many of us would do that. The tense of the verb there, kept back, in the original Greek language indicates that the laborers would never receive their salaries at all. Thou shalt not steal. It's still the law of God, and it's a law he will enforce. As Christians, it behooves us to be faithful to pay our bills. Another way they got their wealth was by controlling the courts. The first part of verse 6. These rich men controlled the courts. It's often the case that those who have wealth also have political power and then get what they want. There was a comic strip back in the 60s, The Wizard of Id. Anybody remember The Wizard of Id? Little stumpy ruler that was over the whole little kingdom. If you read the comics, he said, remember the golden rule. We see the people under him say, what's that? His reply was, whoever has the gold makes the rule. That sounds like something that's going on today. And this was prevalent 2,000 years ago, y'all. And this little comic strip was in the 60s. How much more prevalent is it today? We see it. Like I said, it's some 60 years ago later, and we still see the same thing today. James asks, do not the rich men oppress you and draw you before the judgment seats? James 2 and verse 6. When the name Watergate's mentioned, do you think of a beautiful hotel? Yeah, probably not. The word reminds us of an ugly episode in American history that led to the revelation of lies and the resignation of the President of the United States. Each side accused the other of obstructing justice and manipulating the laws. When God established Israel in her land, he gave the people a system of courts. You can see that in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 8 through 13. He warned the judges not to be greedy. Exodus 18, verse 21. They were not to be partial to the rich or the poor. Leviticus 19 and verse 15. No judge was to tolerate perjury. Deuteronomy 19, verses 16 through 21. Bribery was condemned by the Lord. Isaiah 33 and 15, and then again in Micah chapter 3. The prophet Amos denounced the judges in his day who took bribes and fixed cases. See this in Amos chapter 5. The courts in James' day were apparently easy to control if you had enough money. The poor workers could not afford expensive lawsuits, so they were beaten down every time. The workers had the just cause, but they were not given justice at all. Instead, they were abused and ruined. The poor man did not resist the rich man because he had no weapons with which to fight. All he could do was call on the Lord for justice. Is any of that ringing a bell today? It's call on the Lord for justice. The Bible warns us against the securing of wealth by illegal means. You know what? God owns all wealth. Psalm 50 and verse 10. He permits us to be his stewards for his wealth and his glory. Proverbs 13 verse 11. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase. It's the hand of the diligent that makes rich. Proverbs 10 and verse 4. Do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Proverbs 23 and verse 4. We must put God first in our lives. Did you hear what I said? I'm going to say it again. We as Christians must put God first in our lives. And he will see to it that we always have all that we need. We see that in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. The second reason that James' exhortation was the way the rich used their wealth. So the second thing he took note of was the way the rich used their wealth. We see this in verses 3, 4, and 5. So it's bad enough to gain wealth in a sinful way, but to use that wealth in sinful ways just makes the sin even worse. One way the rich used their wealth was they stored it up. Verse 3. Of course, there's nothing sinful about saving. We see that in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 14. For the children ought not to lay up for their parents, but the parents for the children. We see it again in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8. But if any provide not his own, and specifically for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than the infidel. And then Matthew 25 and verse 27. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received mine own with usury. But it is wrong to store up wealth when you owe money to your employees. These rich men were hoarding their gain, their gold, and their garments. They thought that they were rich because they had these possessions. Instead of laying up treasures in heaven by using their wealth for God's glory, Matthew 6 and verse 19, they were selfishly guarding it for their own security and pleasure. Not more than 10 years after that, James wrote this letter. Jerusalem fell to the Romans, and all the accumulation wealth was taken. So what did James mean by laying up treasures in heaven? Did he mean we should sell everything and give to the poor, as he instructed the rich young ruler to do? Yeah, I don't think so. He spoke that way to the rich young ruler because covetousness was a young man's pressing sin, and Jesus wanted to expose it. To lay up treasures in heaven means to use all that we have as his stewards' wealth. To lay up treasures in heaven means that we use all that we have as his stewards to God's wealth. We may possess many things, but you know what? We don't own them. We don't own not the first thing. God is the owner of everything, and we are his stewards. What we possess and use are merely things apart from the will of God. When we yield to his will and use what he gives us to serve him, then things become treasures, and we are investing in eternity. What we do on earth is recorded in heaven. And God keeps the books, and he pays the interest. What a tragedy it is to see people head up treasures for the last days, heap them up, save them up, instead of laying up treasures in heaven for eternity. The Bible does not discourage such saving or even investing, but it does condemn hoarding. Another way that they used their wealth was they kept others from benefiting from it. Verse 4. By fraudulent means, the rich men robbed the poor. The rich men were not using their own wealth, but they would not pay their laborers and permit them to use the wealth. Since we are stewards of God's wealth, we have certain responsibilities to our master. We must be faithful to use what he gives us for the good of others and the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 2, moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. Joseph was a faithful steward in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar prospered. There are ways that we can use God's wealth to help others. Another way they used their wealth was they lived in luxury. Verse 5. You have lived in high style on earth would be a literal translation of James 5:5. Luxury is waste, and waste is sin. All of us are grateful for the good things of life, and we would certainly not want to return to primitive conditions. I mean, how many of you want to go back to an outhouse? No, we like our bathrooms. We like our air conditioner. We like our heaters. But we recognize the fact that there's a point of diminishing returns. Tell me what thou dost need, said the Quaker to his neighbor, and I will tell thee how to get along without it. Jesus said in Luke 12 and verse 15, and he said unto them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. The rich men James addressed were feeding themselves on the riches and starving to death. The Greek word pictures cattle being fattened for the slaughter. There's a great difference between enjoying what God has given us, 1 Timothy 6 verse 17, and living extravagantly on what we have withheld from others. Even if what we have has been earned lawfully and in the will of God, we must not waste it on selfish living. There are too many needs to be met. Luxury has a way of ruining character. It's a form of self-indulgence. If you match character with wealth, you can produce much good. But if you match self-indulgence with wealth, its result is sin. The third reason that James was speaking here is he saw what their riches will do. So he explains what their riches will do here. And this is through verses 1 through 4. The rich thought that they had it made because of their wealth. But God thought otherwise. Howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Verse 1. James described the consequences of misusing riches. He said riches will vanish. Misused riches erode character. Verse 3. Judgment is certainty. Verses 3 and 5. The loss of a precious opportunity. Verse 3. So let's talk about riches will vanish. Verse 2 and verse 3. So grain will rot. It's corrupted. That was James verse 2, 5 verse 2. Gold will rust, and garments will become moth-eaten. Nothing material in this world will last forever. Nothing. The seeds of death and decay are found in all creation. It's a great mistake to think there's security in wealth. Paul wrote, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches. It says in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 17. Why? Because riches are uncertain. The money market fluctuates from hour to hour, sometimes minute to minute, and so does the stock market. Actually, gold doesn't rust the way iron does, but the idea is the same. The gold's losing its value. Add to this the fact that life's short. Do we all agree? Life's short. We're getting older day by day, second by second. And that we cannot take wealth with us when we die. Then you can see how foolish it is to live for the things of this world. Another way they misused riches, the misused riches erode in character. They erode your character. Verse 3. Their corrosion and shall eat you like fire. Verse 3. This is a present judgment. The poison of wealth has infected them, and they are being eaten alive. Of itself, money is not sinful. It's neutral. But for the love of money is the root of all evil. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 18. It is good to have riches in your hand, provided they do not get into your heart. Psalm 62 and verse 10. If riches increase, set not your heart upon them. Proverbs 22 and verse 1 says, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver or gold. Then judgment is a certainty. Verses 3 and 5. James not only saw a present judgment, their wealth decaying, their character eroding, but also a future judgment before God. Jesus Christ will be the judge. James 5 and verse 9. And his judgment will be righteous. Note the witness that God will call on that day of judgment. First, the rich man's wealth will witness against them. Verse 3. Their rotten grain, rusted gold and silver, moth-eaten garments will bear witness of the selfishness of their hearts. There's a bit of irony here. The rich men saved their wealth to help them, but their hoarded riches will only testify against them. The wages they held back will also witness against them in court. James 5, first part of verse 4. Money speaks. The stolen salaries cry out to God for justice and judgment. God heard Abel's blood cry out from the ground in Genesis 4 and verse 10, and he hears the stolen money cry out too. The workers will also testify against them, verse 4. There will be no opportunities for the rich to bribe the witnesses or the judge, because Jesus is the judge. God hears the cries of his oppressed people, and he will judge them righteously. This judgment is serious. The lost will stand before Christ at the great white throne. The saved will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. God will not judge our sins because they've already been judged on the cross. But he will judge our works and our ministry. If we've been faithful serving and glorifying him, we will receive a reward. If we have been unfaithful, we'll lose our reward, but not our salvation. Then he saw the loss of a precious opportunity. And we stand in this as well. Verse 3. The last days indicates that James believed that the coming of the Lord Jesus was near. James 5, verses 8 and 9. We must buy up opportunity. That would be like a literal translation of Ephesians 5 and verse 16. We must buy up opportunity and work while it is day. We see that in John 9, verse 4. Think of the good that could have been accomplished with the hoarded wealth. There were poor people in that congregation that could have been helped. James 2, verses 1 through 6 tells us about them. There were workers who deserved their wages. It's good to have the things that money can buy, provided you also have the things that money cannot buy. What good is an expensive house if there's no home? Or an expensive diamond ring if there's no love? James did not condemn riches or rich people. He condemned the wrong use of riches and rich people who use their wealth as a weapon and not as a tool with which to build. It is possible to be poor in this world, James 2 and verse 5, but yet rich in the next world. It's also possible to be rich in this world, 1 Timothy 6 and verse 17, and poor in the next world. The return of Jesus Christ will make some people poor and others rich, depending on the spiritual condition of their hearts. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. What we keep, we lose. What we give to God, we keep, and he adds interest to it. Indeed, money speaks. I want to ask you a question today in closing. What will that money say to you or about you in the last judgment?